People are really, really hoping for certainty about some things. And I think the biggest struggle that we face is everyone's uncomfortableness with uncertainty. I think if you get comfortable with uncertainty, you end up being much more fearless.
Welcome to Parallax by Ankur and a podcast produced by Radcliffe Cardiology to bring you a new angle of all things cardiology and the best from the US Cardiology Review. Published every second Monday, Ankur MD, interventional cardiologist at the Cleveland Clinic in Ohio, USA, speaks with legendary cardiologists, reviews late-breaking trials, and interviews authors of our latest and best US Cardiology Review articles. We call them #audio articles. Parallax is the effect whereby the position or direction of an object appears to differ when viewed from different positions. So this podcast is your fix of reliable updates on all things cardiology by someone from a non-traditional background who is always looking at the industry from a new angle. Now, here's your host, Ankur MD.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Parallax. This one is particularly very, very, very special for me. And the reason it's that special for me is because the guest on today's show is my former attending. And, thanks to him and thanks to his generosity, I know how busy he is, that he still, finds time for me. And he's always been able to connect to me whenever I've tried to reach out to him. So he's been extremely, extremely kind and generous to me. So, without much further ado, I'm going to introduce him formally. I have on the show today Dr. Mike Gibson. Dr. Mike Gibson is Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School. He's an interventional cardiologist at my alma mater, Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston, Massachusetts. And he's the Chief Executive Officer of BAME and Perfuse Research Institutes. Dr. Gibson, welcome on the show. If we were doing this in person, I'd probably give you a hug. And thanks again for your time and for being on the show with us today. I'm sure we're going to learn a lot from you.
Well, a big virtual hug to you, Ankur.
Thank you. So, you've, I obviously, before even I was at BI Deaconess, and this was in 2015, I'm sure every cardiologist would know of your, just incredible body of work that you've done to advance the field forward. But, what really struck me was how balanced you were, when it came to, spending time with us or spending time in the research laboratories that you run several clinical trials, and a lot of them have been New England Journal of Medicine papers. That's the pinnacle for us, or perhaps for anyone in science and medicine. And then, you're in an incredible family, man. So just an incredible father to your kids. And we were friends on several social media accounts, and I've just relished how much you celebrate your kids, which is so good to see, quite frankly, for someone like me who's at the early stages of being a father of two boys, and then. But besides that, you have, you paint, and, these are not, paintings. I mean, one could auction these paintings. I mean, these paintings are so good. So you're obviously multi-talented, and you're a man of many talents. How do you balance all these acts and do them all so perfectly? What's the mantra? What's the secret?
Well, some people have to work out in order to feel good and start their day. I wish I could say I like to paint. I do like to paint. Not only do I like to paint, I feel compelled to paint. I think if you're an artist, you're a bit like one of those runners who gets a runner's high. You get a dopamine high perhaps from creating your art. But I guess I would say it's the best way that I found to combat burnout. I think if I wasn't well balanced, and when I'm not well balanced, I will say, because I get into ruts like all of us where I'm not well balanced, I get tired more easily. I think you have to have something that you really love to look forward to. something to be excited about outside of the workplace. And that's, for me, painting. It used to be photography, but now it's obviously painting. I paint a good chunk of my nights, a lot of my weekends. It is how I recharge. It's something that people, my family, can sit around in the room and kind of read and watch, and we talk. In the summers, I sit out by the pool, and friends come over. They all drink and sit behind me and watch me paint. I listen, and I turn around now and then and talk to them. So while it's often thought to be a solitary kind of process, for me, I like to do it surrounded by friends and family, and they like it. They like watching, and they like commenting and making suggestions. So in some ways, it's more of a family activity, a group activity. So, but it really is the thing at this point in my life. I'm older than you. It is the thing that I get the most joy out of, other than my kids, at this point in my life.
Yeah, so, just incredible answer. And, before I get to how you found painting as a passion, which you have, pursued relentlessly, let's just, rewind and take us through your formative years and, your years growing up, and, what inspired you to pursue a career in medicine. How did cardiology happen? I know you've worked very closely with Dr. Eugene Braunwald. I mean, everyone in the field of cardiovascular medicine knows about Dr. Braunwald. And then, you're you've sort of been at Harvard ever since. But, the audience would really like to learn more about how, Mike Gibson became the Mike Gibson we know of today. And then I would like to, probably explore, the different paths that I find or that I discover myself, parts of you that I do not know or have not known, would form an interesting conversation. But, I'll have you answer that question for us first.
Sure. Well, I came from a place that's about as far removed from Boston and Harvard Medical School as you could get. I was born in Oklahoma, and I spent a fair chunk of time as in my very formative years in a place called Stilwell, Oklahoma. And Stilwell was recently in the news as the small town, or the worst town in the United States in terms of life expectancy, with a life expectancy of 56 to 57 years. And, I have to say, when I was growing up there, I thought Stilwell was the greatest place on earth. I had a great life. I was with my grandparents a lot. They had a farm. They also ran an auto repair store. And life was so different then. I'd get up in the morning, I'd get in the truck and ride to work in the back of the truck. You couldn't imagine that now. I'd hang out in the auto repair store when it was time for me to take a nap. They would put me in a car that they put up on the racks to work underneath it. So that was the idea of babysitting back in the early 1960s. Every day I'd go up the street to get a chili dog with my grandma at the Rexall drugstore. She kept me busy learning to count and doing math. She was actually quite a mathematician. She got her master's in math at the University of Arkansas. Very rare for a woman back in the, I would say 30s or 40s. Very, very rare for a woman, or late 20s, to become a math major or master's degree. I think one of my most prized possessions, she left me just a little box, and in that box was a proof of how to trisect an angle. And of course it was wrong. You can't trisect an angle, but I was always very thrilled that my grandma was always trying to do things like those kinds of mathematical proofs. But here in the middle of nowhere, this woman, taught me numeracy, taught me all she could about math. And she still at the age of 84, was running that auto repair store all by herself, single-handed, a very tough woman from Oklahoma, but very loving. And as was my grandfather, at night, we would go home. Again, I'd ride home in the back of the pickup truck. I would go out, feed the cows, after that, there might be some time they had a pool. I guess you'd call it a pool. It was really more of a cement hole in the ground where there were turtles, frogs, snakes, fish we caught, all kinds of things. I remember catching all the tadpoles and putting them in a tub and watching them all grow up. It's not like a modern pool. It really was more like a pond. And they would sit there and read the newspaper, and I would go in the pond, or I guess you'd call it a pool. And the nights were simple, with them and my parents. We would sit around, watch the Ed Sullivan Show. It was a very simple time. But what I was struck by, there was a large Indian population there. There still is a large Indian population there. And as much as my grandmother tried to teach me, there was really not a lot of access to printed information. She gave me a nickel one day and said, "Why don't you go up to the book fair and buy yourself a book?" And all I could really get was, as I always tell in my TEDx talk, was the letter C from 1927. And that was my internet. I just looked through that encyclopedia so much because I was really hungry for knowledge, but really didn't have a lot of access. My father was traveling a lot. He worked for Sinclair Oil. My mom was an artist and a painter, and obviously that influenced me. My grandmother also loved interior design, art, was always pulling me around, taking me everywhere to go to different fabric stores. And, she really loved interior decorating. So I was exhausted by it all. She had more energy than any person I knew. And she was also a seamstress and made quilts. That was her kind of artistic endeavor. But between her and my mother, I really got a boatload of kind of artistic kind of upbringing when I was young. I wasn't much of a painter. My mom would, coach me to paint. And, I think I remember starting off painting clouds because those were easy, she said. And she said, look up in the sky and, once you paint a cloud like you're doing now, you'll never look at a cloud the same way again. And that was very true. If you paint something, you really become a keen observer. And I do think that is how art kind of interdigitated or informed my scientific career. For instance, I believe it or not, I actually painted angiograms, and it was a way that I got to be a more keen observer of angiograms. And one of the things I noticed was, there's the dye in the artery, but then there's this dye at the end of the rundown in the heart muscle, and it was different than the ribs and the lung. And that was my first kind of real staring at the myocardium. And that's, to be honest, that's how I kind of came up with the blush. The blush is that cloud of dye in the heart muscle. And once I painted it, like my mother said, I never really looked at an angiogram the same again. So I do think art does inform you as a scientist. I think, and I've said it many times on Twitter, I think you have to be a data collector, and you have to look at raw data to really get an organic feeling for data. I think science, I think art is a very different endeavor than science. Science is very reductionist, breaking things down into little bits. Art is almost the opposite. It's very synthetic. It's really learning to look at the whole rather than all these little parts. It's inductive. It's not deductive. Science has very, very clear lines and very, very clear yes and no answers. I think my biggest failing when I was younger as an artist was thinking that everything was lines, and that painting really was staying within the lines. And in my early artistic career, I was a photographer, and that certainly was all lines. And I'm really happy that I began to break away from that a decade or two ago by being a painter, where you really, in the way I paint, you often don't focus on staying within the lines. You really focus on blocks of color, blocks of paint, and masses of paint, rather than formal boundaries. And I think it kind of parallels some of my development as a person, too. You know, I think when we're young, we think of the world as black and white, yes and no. But you get to be older and you realize so much of the world is gray and muddy and less distinct than you thought it was. And I like to think my painting has begun to see that kind of subtlety in the world around me and really begin to, you know, use that kind of softness of transitions and patches of this and that to convey meaning rather than some very crisp line to demarcate things. And I think the older you get, the more porous you get and the more the less you are at boundaries and more inclusive you are.
Yeah, you know, what an artistic, poetic answer. I'm extremely fascinated by the answer that you've given, and you know, only you can give that answer. And it's actually a good segue for, because as you were speaking, I was formulating this next question, which I'm going to ask you, and that is, I mean, you're the perfect blend of an artist and a scientist. I mean, you know, a scientist to the cadre that you've published several New England Journal of Medicine papers. And you know, what you mentioned was that, you know, science is deductive and art is inductive, and there's a lot of gray, you know, which there is in real life and the world. And, you know, I think as a clinical investigator par excellence, and, you know, having run multiple clinical trials, you know, we try to be as black and white as we may, you know, through the construct of a randomized clinical trial, to arrive at a conclusion or at an answer which, you know, we think can dichotomize patients into, you know, one group versus the other. But then there's real world, and, you know, patients have their own complexities, and, you know, patients don't come in with an inclusion and exclusion criteria like you know, that of a randomized clinical trial. Has your development in or artistic, you know, instinct or influence, or, you know, just a practice of art the way you do, has that influenced your clinical decision making as a practicing cardiologist? You know, because you know, you have that, you fit in the roles of a scientist and an artist, like I said, and then you're also a practitioner. How has art and the understanding of gray influenced your decision making, you know, in the cath lab or when you're seeing patients?
Yeah, I think, you know, what's interesting is when I was younger, I got very frustrated by having to pay some CRO $40,000 to help get the data for one of my first papers. And I made a commitment to learning how to analyze all the data myself, and really, you know, became quite a good statistician with a lot of help from some of the people at the School of Public Health. And back then I was very black and white, and things had yes, no answers. And, you know, multivariate models had, you know, showed certainly that a lot of different things influenced the outcome. So I began to grasp that life is multivariate. But I think as I grew further, I began to realize that a lot of these things are collinear in the multivariate model. So, you know, when you talk about, let's talk about kidney function. Well, kidney function, that's not just the kidney, that's also age. You know, if you just look at everything inside creatinine clearance, age, gender, race, the kidney function. But what you see is that all these four things kind of run together. And I remember one paper I wrote where I called it a multivariate map. When you look at the amount of blockage, or the blood flow rather, after a thrombolytic, well, you can make a map. And I did make this chart, which shows some of it's percent stenosis, but percent stenosis is also related to the amount of time that it took for that person to get to the hospital. It's related to, you know, which artery it was, the right having more clot. It's related to how long it took for the person to get to the cath lab. The quicker the trip, maybe the more clot where the drug hadn't worked. It's related to the perfusion downstream. It's related to the amount of vessel distal to that blockage, because when you open up the artery, it's not the blockage that's dictating blood flow. It is actually microvascular perfusion downstream. So big heart attacks cause slow blood flow, not slow blood flow causing big heart attacks. It's a little bit of a circular issue. When you look at the map, it's this blob of all these overlapping variables: time, perfusion, clot. All these things are related to each other as well as to blood flow. So life really is multivariate. It really is unbelievably complex. And, I think what I've grown to learn more about as I got older is interaction terms. How does age modulate the outcome? Well, that's a first order interaction term, but then there's a second order interaction term. How does gender interact with age, which interacts with treatment term? And then how does race interact with gender, which interacts with age? So, in other words, everything is related to everything else. And you begin to realize that it's so complicated, and there are no black and white real answers. It's all very gray. Even when you do a trial, you've picked out one part of the universe to look at, and you have to be very careful that you don't apply it to everything else. But life really is gray, and you have to really look at all those relationships and collinearity, colliders, all that. That's become more heightened in my mind, I guess, the older I get, of just how complicated all it is. I'm at that part of that line of you think you know everything, and then you realize you really don't know a whole lot. I'm kind of down at the bottom of that, trying to make my way out.
Yeah, and it's amazing, right? The evolution of us when we, I'll talking based on my experience as well, just going through medical school and, trying to memorize knowledge and, making sure that you try and have a grasp of, every disease condition, every organ, and every pathological condition that may perhaps affect that organ. And as you then graduate from medical school and start residency, you start to realize how much of it is that we actually really do not know. And then you go through fellowship and you try to pick up an organ of interest and try to master it to the best that you can, only to realize that what you were taught was actually wrong. So, as an investigator, how important you think is for practicing clinicians to be open-minded, have a curious mind, and also have self-inquiry as practice, and how to take feedback and criticism in a positive way, because I'm sure there's people obviously are very smart and well-read in cardiovascular medicine, as I've experienced, and there's so much new information that is new knowledge that gets generated and comes out, and there's so much to garner. I mean, you're at the meetings, you interview all the all the practice changing scientists that contribute to our field. How do you assimilate all the data and all the information? You mentioned that it's important to be a data collector and look at raw data yourself. To sort of figure things out. So how do you practically implement that in your daily practice?
Well, I think it's a really tough thing, very, very hard. And I've grown through the years. When I was a young person, I, like most interventional cardiologists, valued certainty and confidence. I think when you look at young operators, they're so confident and certain that they're doing the right thing. It's almost perceived as a weakness if you aren't certain about the right strategy or confident in that answer, because you yourself place tremendous value on your own confidence in getting through a procedure. I think as you get older, like me, you realize that so many of the things you held, near and dear to your heart as true just didn't turn out to be true. For coronary blood flow, it's been a 30-year journey, and I still I said the other day, I find it a mystery wrapped in a riddle that's an enigma topped in secret sauce. It just is very, very complicated. And the more I learn, the more complicated it gets. And I think for me, the biggest advance that I made was getting comfortable with a lack of certainty. And I think we see that in the pandemic right now. People are really, really hoping for certainty about some things. And I think the biggest struggle that we face is everyone's uncomfortableness with uncertainty. I think if you get comfortable with uncertainty, you end up being much more fearless. And it's something that comes from within. I think you have to get very comfortable with it. And because you have a lot of people around you who are very ego-driven, who really pride themselves still on certainty, want to view the world as linear, black and white, and they've got the answers. And you have to be pretty comfortable with yourself to kind of quietly laugh inside and just kind of shake your head and just say that the world's not that way. But that's been a personal journey of mine, and I do think it's helpful. When you talk with a patient, I think some patients want, very certain answers, but I try and be truthful with patients that this could help you. I hope it helps you. It may not. We think this is better for you. Every patient's different, but, hopefully this will help you, rather than black and white answers. But I guess that's been my journey.
Yes, no, I understand. I mean, you're coming from a beautiful place within you, within your heart, of extremely deep understanding at a spiritual level. I follow spiritual practices myself, but when I hear you, that's what I interpret, and it's beautiful for me to hear those words from you. From someone who's as accomplished as you are and has contributed a significant amount of, data and literature and science, to cardiovascular medicine, is very refreshing for someone who's young in a career like mine to hear. And there is a certain amount of vulnerability, in your response, which is very refreshing. You sort of, I could not agree more when you said that a lot of it is ego driven, particularly in our field, right? In the field of interventional cardiology, where, you've obviously got great operators and there's a certain body language that one has come to anticipate or, expect from interventionalists. And, if you then come across as a thoughtful, speculative, mindful, compassionate, spiritually driven interventionalist, that may be construed. I'm not saying that's true, but that may be construed as, lack of competence or incompetence, unfortunately. But, like you said, you sort of have this laugh inside you, and, sort of move on and try to do what's best for the patient. Would you agree with that interpretation, Dr. Gibson, or do you think that I interpreted that?
No, I fully agree. And, it is that kind of body language of alpha male certainty that people seem to compete on. And it takes a lot of courage. To take a step back and say, I'm not going to compete in that way. I'm going to allow myself to be vulnerable, to tell people I have uncertainties about what they're saying and doing. They get angered by that. And I think at the end of the day, you have to be comfortable in your own mind that you really are acting in the patient's best interest rather than your ego's best interest. And not put your desire to be technically, a wizard ahead of doing what you really think is best for the patient, and not competing to see who can do the most interventions, or the most complicated interventions, or the the craziest thing in the cath lab. This sometimes all that is not what's in the best interest of the patient. Put the patient's interest first. I do view medicine as a spiritual challenge. I personally find, you will be about as good of a doctor as you feel along with your patients. On the other hand, doing that really drains you. If you're a sensitive and empath like I am, you really get very, very, very drained of all your emotional energy. So you have to do a lot to try and protect your emotional energy. And that kind of runs counter to what I was saying about vulnerability. But I think by getting older, you do learn to be vulnerable, but not allow yourself to be drained. And I do think that's why things, for me at least, I found my recharging in painting. Well, you have to have those activities that recharge your spiritual battery.
Yes, and so as a follow up to that, how do you conserve your emotional energy? Because I'd like to think that I'm compassionate and emotional and empathic, but like you said, it drains you. I mean, there are cases with complications that still haunt me, and I wish I could have done things differently, and and then you sort of end up becoming really close to the family, right, and to the patient, and but that you sort of take those emotions with you back home also, and then you want to be as emotionally present and available for your kids. So how do you? And you are you're an incredible father. I don't know if I've told you that before, but I am now, and so I really really respect you for that. Respect you a lot for that. Obviously I respect you for many other things, but particularly for that, I respect you a lot. How did you conserve energy to be present and available for your kids, and you still are, on a continual basis you are?
Looking back, when I was a 30-some-year-old, I was too consumed by medicine, and I wish I had been more available to my kids until my first wife and I got separated, and we co-parented, and she was going to school. So I had the kids, every weekend from Friday night, Saturday, Sunday, and then some on Wednesdays. So I actually had a lot of time with them, and I had, as a single parent at that point, there was no one else to help, and it really actually forced me to be emotionally engaged with my kids, my boys. And, we really didn't have anything. We were living in Brighton in pretty poor conditions. We had one bed. We shared one bed, me and the boys. When I had to go in on call, they had to come with me to the hospital and, kind of hang out in the protected booth or in my office. And they kind of grew up with medicine. I guess when my son went into medicine, I was a little surprised, and I tried to caution him. I said, I don't know that this is a healthy profession. I think it takes so much out of you personally that it depends on who you are. I mean, if you care, and if you're empathic, and if you're sensitive, it takes so much out of you personally that it can really drain you and your family of your emotional engagement. And I was surprised that he made the choice to go into medicine. I guess in some ways I was pleased to see that he went into medicine, to kind of feel as though I hadn't damaged him, during my 30s. But, whenever I traveled, I tried to integrate my kids into my travel. I always did. When I would go to meetings, medical meetings, they would come with me. They flew all over the world with me. So I tried to make it a life where I did involve my kids as much as possible in medicine. And both of them seemed to really, actually, the boys during that period seemed to actually have liked it. and seem to really may have grown a lot from it. They really love to travel. Both of them love to travel. They travel to crazy places. They do crazy things like be the first person to scale this mountain in India this year, to go to all these crazy exotic places. So they inherited my love of travel and exploration, and they also inherited my eclectic nature. So, and my son commented on that in his wedding speech, that he felt fortunate to have been raised by the most eclectic person in the most eclectic way possible. But I wish I had been, I think medicine's dangerous. It's dangerous to families. It's dangerous to marriages. It's dangerous to parenting. And I think there should be more work done to educate people about those dangers, because it can really suck you in, and you have to be careful.
Yes, such an informed answer, right? Like such a well-rounded, informed, experienced answer from someone who's coming from an honest, deep and spiritual place in his heart. I couldn't thank you more for this. So let me ask you a few questions. I've always wanted to sort of ask these questions to you, but we met each other last year at TCT, and you obviously have a lot of commitments and are busy. But how enjoyable is going to various medical meetings for you? How enjoyable it is, even at this stage in your career and life? And I know you do a stellar job interviewing, all the late breaking presenters and other investigators who've presented abstracts which you perceive may change the course of how we practice cardiology and medicine. How is that experience for you? Like after having done this for years and years and years?
I love doing what I do. I have to say I get kind of drained, interviewing, 20 people a day, maybe doing 60 interviews at a meeting. It's very exciting, but, you talk about that energy. It is kind of emotionally draining. I get kind of excited by it all, and that excitement kind of drains my battery. That's fun and good, but what I really thrive on is the private time that I have with old friends who I love very much, and just the quiet times with them, one-on-one, away from the public. And it's great to see old friends at the meetings. Even people in Boston, I don't even see them when I'm in Boston, but I see them at the meetings. So I think the meetings really have two important contributions. One is science, but for me, an equal, if not greater, contribution is those personal relationships, which I really, really I thrive on and love.
Yeah, and then as a follow up to that, Boston is my favorite city. Has been my favorite city for a long time. And you've lived in Boston now for how long, Dr. Gibson?
Gosh, on and off since '86. So what's that? 34 years now, but 3 years out at UCSF. So 31 years here.
Yeah. So I'm sure you've really enjoyed your time at Harvard. I was there for a limited time, but tell us about life as professor of medicine at arguably the best medical school in the world. What do you want people to learn and take away? Because we're obviously downloaded in many countries, and even in the US, a lot of people aspire to be at some stage in their lives of medical training, which is long. They do want to be at Harvard Medical School hospitals. What would you have to share with them? And what about Boston and Harvard Medical School still enthralls you?
Yeah, boy, that's a tough question. I think for my medical life, it's great to be immersed in a culture. It's all about culture. It's all about who you run into in the hallways. That really is actually, I think, so cool. We have Cath Conference as an example. And, during the Cath Conference, you would have myself, Bobby Ye, to the left, Jeff Popma, Dwayne Pinto. You have a lot of world's experts just all kind of talking about cases. And it's hard to reproduce that. You can be the smartest guy in the room, but if you're the smartest guy in the room, you're probably in the wrong room. You need to find a room where you grow and you learn. And by the way, the tribe is always smarter than the one individual. And this is a pretty sharp tribe. So, you're also only as good of a tennis player as the person you're practicing with and playing across from. It makes you keep your game up and is quite good. Now, the downside is it's a very, very, very competitive environment, very much an environment of what have you done for me lately? And if the money dries up, the funding dries up, well, then you may need to move on. So it's a tough environment to be in. But I would also like to say that even though you get that kind of stimulation from being here, I also find some of the best times I have and some of the best meetings I have is when I go around the country and go to different meetings where you have a lot of different experts from a lot of different parts of the country. And that's equally, if not more engaging, because you have even more variety of opinions. Boston is not the epicenter of art. And if it was left up to me, I would probably be living, if I could live anywhere, I'd probably be living, in Santa Fe or in Laguna Beach or in, Northern California somewhere telecommuting. I wouldn't say it is the greatest spot for me as an artist, but I think for medical culture, it's quite good.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah, no, I mean, well, if you run into them again on a Wednesday morning Cath conference, please give my regards to all of them. I hold them in deep regard, and I sort of try to communicate that through social media, through Twitter. But having to just have that nonverbal communication of deference and really camaraderie is something that I also miss about the meetings. And yeah, well, any closing remarks, Dr. Gibson? This has been a fascinating conversation, so thank you for making the time. Any closing remarks for young, early career interventionalists or early career cardiologists, or just people in residency and fellowship? Those happen to be our audience for the most part.
Yeah, I think it's a little like the electronic medical record. You shouldn't be working for the electronic medical record. The electronic medical record should be working for you. You could work some for medicine, but medicine has to be working for you as a human. And don't let medicine consume you. Don't let medicine chew you up and spit you out. Don't let your hospital chew you up and spit you out. You do have more alternatives than you think. You do have more value than you think. Don't ever put your family second. Put your family first. When the chips are down, it's only your family who will be with you, not a lot of these other people. And learn to take care of yourself, because if you don't take care of yourself, you're not going to be able to take care of other people. And most of all, learn to love one another. Love is the most powerful force in the world. Just chill out, love people, don't fight so hard, don't be so angry.
Great closing remarks. Thanks again, Dr. Gibson. It was just an amazing podcast. Thank you again for your wisdom, for your honesty, transparency, and vulnerability. I truly, truly enjoyed it. Thanks again.
All right, man. Good talking.
Yeah, likewise.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Dear cardiologists, we want to make this podcast about you and for you. So please email us your critical thoughts, comments, and questions at podcast@radcliffe-group.com and visit uscjournal.com for more information. You can also follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram at Radcliffe Cardiology for daily updates. Join thousands of cardiologists and become a Radcliffean by registering to radcliffecardiology.com. You will receive regular newsletters and gain access to hundreds of expert interviews, educational webinars, clinical cases, and peer-reviewed articles from our 6 medical review journals on general cardiology, interventional cardiology, arrhythmia and electrophysiology, cardiac failure, and vascular and endovascular surgery. Thank you.